Somebody has insulted him, or at least has stood up to him and said, Yabu sucks, you're wrong, and he doesn't like it. So he said, right, that's it, I'm through, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I mean, it's a really childish way to conduct politics, but I think it's more wounding in that these words of Ronald Reagan have been used, and quite effectively.
The Prime Minister is today hosting a number of European leaders in London, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, at the meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Keir Starmer is going to urge other allies to give Ukraine more long-range weapons to strike back against Russia. But perhaps more significant is the news that China and India have suspended purchases from Russia's biggest producers of oil after Donald Trump imposed sanctions on those companies. Now, the idea behind the Coalition of the Willing was that if the US won't help Ukraine, us European will. But now it seems that Donald Trump is actually doing more to take on Putin. Michael, does this Coalition of the Willing, it is important, but actually it's insignificant compared to what Donald Trump can do.
Absolutely. They can't begin to do anything until there's some kind of ceasefire. I mean, they can't actually patrol a peace if there's no peace to keep. Coalition of the Willing means we're ready to support Ukraine. Well, the Europeans have done a lot, quite a lot, but by comparison with what America could do, very little. I mean, the Americans have the capacity to arm Ukraine to the point where it could actually make a sizable difference in the battle. Tomahawks especially. The Europeans have given a lot of weapons, but not enough for what's needed. I think, yes, Trump putting pressure on Putin, and it looks as though at the moment he's angry with Putin, not surprisingly. He wanted a Budapest summit, he hoped that would be another triumph, and then it all sort of turned sour. So now he's in sort of a cross mood. You don't quite know how long this anger will last, or when, he switches backwards and forwards. But I think the pressure on Russia by putting sanctions on countries buying Russian oil is significant, because the Russian economy, although it's held up surprisingly well for the past 2 or 3 years, it's actually beginning to really suffer now from the effect of the war, the effect of all the spending going to the military, the effect of there's no investment, that people are emigrating. They need a boost. And if they can't sell their oil, or at least they sell much less of it, that's really going to hurt.
Daisy, do you think that the Coalition of the Willing, though, is still needed? Because we know that Trump is not the most constant of allies. He does have a tendency to change his mind in his position.
Yeah, he absolutely can blow hot and cold. So, yes, of course, it's very important that coalition sticks together. But equally, as Michael was implying, Trump is the main character in this. He knows he is. And I think it was very significant when we were watching him and the Middle East last week, that he immediately went home. We went back to the States to have a meeting with Zelensky. He is turning his attention to that. We know how incredibly vain Donald Trump is. We know he's talking and thinking about getting that Nobel Peace Prize that he so desperately wants. And that is helpful. That whether or not that makes him a better or worse person, it is helpful that he has an ambition there, and he knows that Ukraine will probably have to be a part of that.
Well, let's stick with Donald Trump, because he's just announced that he's ending all trade negotiations with Canada. Now, in a social media post, the president said he is taking the action because of ads featuring former President Ronald Reagan criticising tariffs. Now, Trump called the ad a fake. He called it egregious, and he announced that negotiations were, and I quote, hereby terminated. Now, slightly throwing his toys out the pram, Trump likes social media video more than the next person. So compare the two. So here is Ronald Reagan.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. The result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition.
Well, that was Ronald Reagan. So here's the advert.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
So, I don't know if you noticed there, but what's actually happened is that they've used the same words, the same comments that Ronald Reagan made, but they changed the order. The advert's penultimate sentence has been taken from near the beginning of the speech, but they haven't actually altered what Ronald Reagan said. So, Michael, we keep having this conversation about tariffs. Donald Trump maintains that they're a great thing. He's raised a lot of money. He doesn't, of course, mention that it's the American people that are paying those tariffs.
No, but the economists have said it, and I think the figures are beginning to show it. And I think that is slightly worrying to him. He does change his mind all the time. I think you had exactly the right metaphor when you said he's thrown his toys out of the pram, because he's behaved in a petulant and, frankly, childish way. Somebody has insulted him, or at least has stood up to him and said, "Yabu sucks, you're wrong." And he doesn't like it. So he said, "Right, that's it. I'm through. I'm not going to talk to you anymore." It's a really childish way to conduct politics. But I think it's more wounding in that these words of Ronald Reagan have been used, and quite effectively. Of course, the Ronald Reagan Foundation is somewhat embarrassed by that because they are loyal Republicans, so they can't be seen to be a weapon against Trump. So they've sort of said, well, they didn't show proper copyright rules, and they didn't, they took it out of context, and this, that, and the other. They're trying to dissociate themselves from it. But I think it's embarrassing to Trump personally, and I think he's very cross.
Daisy, we are having those conversations about tariffs all over again. As Michael said, the economists have said, well, look, no, it's the American people, it's American companies that have to fork out with those. I'm seeing price rises. But we can't also take away from Donald Trump that he's managed to get people to come to the table. Prime example now, China and India not doing business with some Russian oil companies because Donald Trump has said that he's going to hit them both with tariffs. As a blunt instrument, they seem to be working. They're costing the American consumer money, but they're working for Donald Trump.
They're working for Donald Trump, and we know that what he prides himself on is the art of the deal, and that he's a wheeler dealer rather than a politician first and foremost, and that he will deal with pretty much anybody as long as he gets the outcome he wants to get. And we know that throwing his toys out of the pram is absolutely part and parcel of his technique with all these tariff negotiations and others. He's always saying, I'm cancelling this, I'm walking away from that, and I'm putting 50% tariffs on this, and then there'll be a cooling off period, and then people will get back around the table. It won't be quite what it seemed. So it is sort of Trump 101 on manoeuvres. But as far as the political message of tariffs, he does still believe that they work for him, not necessarily economically, but politically. And and certainly this with Canada, this wasn't an economic decision. This was a political decision.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. And also the relationship with the past Republican Party, Michael, is fascinating. We don't hear anything from George W. Bush, for example. We hear very little from past, what one might call the traditional Grand Old Party figures. They've gone very quiet when Trump's been in office.
Well, they're in a very different party. Trump's Republicans are absolutely quite unlike the sort of East Coast Republicans that we knew in the immediate post-war period, where you had these very grand figures, respectable, educated, very intelligent, slightly right of centre, but not far right by any means. And that sort of tradition has completely vanished. The Republicans now are populists foremost, and they're made in the image of Trump, and they're sort of aggressive, and they want results straight away, and they don't mind breaking things as they go along. And I think the people who had the spirit of the old Republicans, the sort of Rockefellers and people of that era, they just don't feel they don't know what this party is, so they keep quiet.